This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibe. I'm your host Josh, and with us is your other host Puka. Say hi, Puka.
Buenas tardes.
What are we talking about tonight, Puka?
We are putting on our robes and elf ears, or I don't really know how costumes work in LARP, but we're going back into the world of LARP. And we'll be talking about the Shining Host Player's Guide with noted author of said book and wit, Pete Woodworth. Greetings.
Hello.
Welcome back, Pete.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
So yeah, we're here to talk about a book that came out 22 years ago, so I'm sure you remember every single detail.
Oh, gosh. 22 years. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
This book is old enough to drink.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's written by you.
Yes.
There's a Jester's book by Steve Gabena.
Yes, that's actually a typo.
Yeah.
His name's correct further down. It's Grabani.
Ah, okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. They got it right in one spot, but wrong in the other.
Yeah. And it has like a previously published material has appeared in.
Yeah.
Including Denizens of the Dreaming. Which
They did a disclaimer because they'd been talking about how a lot of Mind's Eye books were starting to adapt tabletop material very directly, so that they decided they wanted to try out whether or not they should credit those books with that material, since we pulled from so many different books for the stuff in this one, and but it wasn't actually really previously published.
Yeah,
and
the ideas.
Yeah, and they wanted to show that this was not where these ideas originated. So that's what Cynthia settled on for that. So,
well, you definitely couldn't have published this on your own without White Wolf's permission, and not got sued for those things.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
But do you remember like where this fits into like the tabletop chronology of supplements? Because we're sort of coming to the end of second edition now.
I mean, 2001 feels accurate to me. So
okay,
yeah,
because there's a number of things that aren't in here that could have been, but I mean, there's also space consideration, I guess. But
there's also an ad at the end for werewolf novels coming out in November 2001. So
yeah. But it's not like you finish writing your first draft and then it also comes out immediately. Do you know sort of when the first draft was done?
I remember the most recent book that we drew on was we had Fool's Luck. It was really new. And that stuff got put in at kind of the last minute. So, as I recall, anyway, that was the newest supplement that had just come out, and we squeezed it in at the last second.
Oh, okay. So the Denizens thing was probably they just threw it in there because it was in the book. But
yeah, we had. I mean, this book had so much stuff going on that I think Cynthia also just credited a bunch of things just to make sure we covered our bases.
But we could put it in the Fool's Luck was the last bit.
I think that I could be wrong, and I'm sure someone will correct me if that's the case. But that's the book I remember. It came out, and I remember going to Cynthia and saying, "Can we fit some more in?" And she was not best pleased with me for trying to add like 10,000 words at the last minute, but she did eventually allow it, so I owe her for that.
Yeah, but you didn't add in an extra 6 houses that were
Yeah. I really, really wanted to add a whole bunch of the missing, houses and things. Like my goal was to get as much material from Changeling Tabletop to LARP as possible.
Yep.
And this book was my reward, I guess you could say, for doing Laws of the Night. I had done Laws of the Night revised, and it went over really well. And I wasn't the only person who worked on that, of course, but like, I was one of the consistent Mind's Eye Theater people, and they said, "Well, what are you interested in?" And I said, "We need to do a Changeling follow-up." And Cynthia said, "What do you really think so?" And I said, "I think
I know so."
I said, "I think Changeling is the second most popular LARP behind Vampire," and we had no way of knowing that at the time. And she said, "Really? You think so?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't think the other games are nearly as well suited. Changeling's really good for LARP, and in a way that like Werewolf is not."
I have the biased opinion. I think it's even better than Vampire for LARP, but Just because it's suited does not make it more popular for that. But yeah.
I agree. The setting, like, werewolf and mage and wraith have a lot of elements that do not LARP well.
Mm-hmm.
And hunter is also my other favorite. Hunter's really well suited to LARP.
Oh, okay. That's a very different kind of LARP, I imagine, though.
But yes, hunter LARP is very different. But like Changeling, you can dress in your mortal seeming and go out in public, or you can do face seeming and do full costume and makeup, or and when we went out in mortal seeming, when we went out in public places, we like to do little fey touches like ear tips, or a little bit of makeup, or just a little poking through just for fun.
And yeah, and different players can do mix and match, and it's fine.
Yeah. And so we like to be, if you looked at us closely, you could figure out who we were. And every once in a while, we'd get a White Wolf LARPer who would spot us, and they would know what we were doing. And that was always fun. So, though not quite as fun as the night we showed up at the local goth club, which had an active vampire game with hunter code tattoos all over us, just to scare them. So
you mentioned Hunter, and I wanted to ask, if I'm not mistaken, there was the Laws of the Hunt book, and that's where the Dauntain appeared. And yes. I just wondered if there were other... We have the initial Shining Host book, and then the Shining Host Player's Guide. I know that there was also material scattered through the Mind's Eye Theater journals, but then was there any other stuff that could have been here?
Yeah, there were a few things that they let me put in the Mind's Eye journal. Jess was really good about that. And then the only other book that had Changeling Mind's Eye Theater material, only other actual book, was Laws of the Hunt Revised, because then I actually kind of elbowed my way into that book to write the Dauntain. So I was very determined at the time to be the only person who wrote Changeling LARP rules, because I wanted them to be consistent. And also I just love Changeling and I didn't mind doing it, but I wanted them to be consistent. So I basically bullied my way onto that book. So
when you were adapting stuff from those other books that are listed here on the credits page, were there any that were particularly tough to adapt or very straightforward?
The trickiest ones that I remember in terms of just the complexity were the Nunnehe and the Inanime, because their rules are significantly different than regular Cathane in a lot of ways. And we wanted to preserve that, but that was also just sort of a difficulty they had in the tabletop that came over with the LARP. So that it wasn't so much that they were really difficult, it's just that they don't always mix as well as we wanted them to.
Yeah, I think you had a similar problem that C20 had, the core book, with doing those two, like, because you have the limited, it's not a full book.
Yeah,
you have the more limited space. They're very different groups. It's not like you're adding a new art or something, and new mechanics and all that stuff. So,
and we did get some pushback, because some of the ways we adapted some of the arts were also not tabletop true. Like, because we took some of the arts from Blood Dim Tides, especially. They had several arts in Blood Dim Tides. And which turned out it was a friend of mine who actually wrote the Changeling stuff. I wasn't friends with him at the time, but we became friends later, and he had worked on Blood Dim Tides. And they had what we called the short arts that only had like 3 levels.
Yeah.
And so we fleshed them out. We gave them more material, or we changed powers that didn't work very well in LARP to ones that we thought would work better. So
but no merfolk are in this book, even though
we tried for the merfolk, which was weird because we got everything else more or less, but
poolside LARP.
Yeah. I mean,
that's the thing. I mean, people buy mer tails, and
I actually famously in one of our Changeling games, I played an Undine, and I was an NPC, and I just lived in the pool all night because we were at a friend's place who had a pool in their backyard. And so they would come to me for information because I was an NPC plot character. And at one point, the 2 knockers came up to me, and the players were they're really just knockers. My friends Danny and Mike, and they built a water clock, a simple one. And they're like, "See what we've done for you?" And I just looked at it and I said, "You have enslaved my people." They smashed it out of their hands, and they looked so they were so proud, and then they realized what they'd done. So
how dare they?
So pool LARP was a thing once.
You can't just croft people.
Yeah, exactly.
I also note from this credits page, I suppose this is true for most Mind's Eye Theater books, but the play tester to everybody else ratio in the credits is dramatic here.
Just like in Shining Host, if you remember, all of the playtesters were my high school friends and my high
Yeah.
school LARP group. This was my college LARP group. So
Ah.
yeah, these were some of them carry over if you go between the two books and look at the playtesters, and some of them are new. But we ran a second game near the end of college to playtest this book, as we had done one in high school to playtest the first one. This time, though, they knew it was a playtest. The first time I surprised everybody. This time they knew. Since I'd been writing for White Wolf for a few years, it was no longer a surprise. But so yeah, this was I was insistent that everybody get their credit. I always try and get every playtester their credit. So
yeah. Also, worth around the credits and stuff, I will say, in a way, this is the last non-art house White Wolf proper Changeling book. That's like just Changeling.
Yep. I had a bad habit of ending out Changeling lines.
Oh no.
So, between this book for Mind's Eye Theater and then Kith Book Issue and everything, for a long time, I was the one who put the lights out on Changeling. So
yeah.
Shall we look through some chapters?
Yeah, sure.
I really enjoyed the opening fiction, I have to say, and I see that. I think that's the one part that you didn't write, but I still enjoy it nevertheless. Especially because we're recording a week after All Souls Night. So
oh yeah, Cynthia's opening fiction was great.
Yeah, it gives a really good representation of how Samhain might go down from a changeling's eye view, which is something that we see alluded to but rarely shown outright like this. And you have the bright path or bright road thing in here as well, so it's like
yeah, I will admit I've always been kind of nervous around Samhain LARP games, but and this is both cool and evocative. It doesn't help me with that fear, but
I understand, believe me.
Yeah,
I understand.
but it's one thing in a tabletop game and everybody knows each other and you keep your safety tools there, but when you get LARP, especially if there's a lot of
this
people,
frankly makes me want to run a Samhain LARP game, but I feel you.
Yeah, I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. I'm saying I'm scared of it.
Honestly, yeah. Well, for me, it's also like, I don't know. Depending on the group, Beltane is a little bit more intimidating, depending on how much physical contact you enjoy in your games. Let's put it that way. But
fair.
Yeah, we always had huge Samhain and Beltane parties for our LARPs.
Yeah.
So Halloween on top of LARP is just LARPer paradise. So yeah, we came up with some traditions and so forth. We had like the Wild Hunt would show up, and there was a creature from the deep dreaming, and you had to put on your mask, and it would come to you and ask questions, and you would deny who you were, even though it knew who you were. As long as you had a mask on, you were safe. So we had we came up with all these weird traditions around it for our games. So
nice.
They're fun though.
Should we briefly describe the story, I guess?
So yeah, it's set in New Orleans, I think, or no, they were supposed to go to New Orleans, then ended up in Chapel Hill.
It was one of the Carolinas where Chapel Hill is.
North Carolina.
And I mean, the plot's pretty short. It's a
it deals a bit with the Samhain mist and like the fact that changelings have their own form of the mist that night to allow people to revel and let down their hair and blow off some steam and speak truth to power without consequence and so forth. So
and
occasionally sacrifice people to hell.
Also that.
So it's a story of a knocker and his Fiona Shee girlfriend, and they travel around. They go to that Samhain party, and then he never sees her again.
Stuff happens.
Yeah. And I liked all the rosemary imagery. That's something
for remembrance.
Yeah, Cynthia really ran with that one.
Yeah,
and I remember because it was funny because some of my friends wouldn't read the credits and they would be like, "Oh my god, I love your story," and I'd have to keep explaining, "No, that wasn't mine."
And then the next chapter's on the Nunnehi.
Yes.
So maybe I didn't remember the rule. Why can't they take remembrance? Is that standard tabletop or I didn't?
That was true to tabletop.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that was true to tabletop, and it's because they're not supposed to necessarily remember past incarnations because their souls recycle differently. So that is one of those elements that we carried over. I actually did kind of try and streamline their rules so they played a little bit better with Cathane. So some corners have been trimmed a little bit, some edges sanded down a little bit. The Nunnehi were always, it's tough because we look back now especially and we're like, I know that Nikki and Jackie did a heck of a lot of research and and they really tried. They were always deep into Appalachian folklore, and like they always tried to really research. They had some friends in the indigenous community, so like they really wanted to do the best job. And I think it's one of those cases where like I've had people read the Nunnehay chapters, and like a lot of the indigenous material in Old White Wolf, a lot of it comes back to we tried. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. For Nikki and Jackie really did try. They really tried to. They did their research. They tried to make sure they weren't corrupting legends or perverting them or oversimplifying them or something like that. But a lot of our stuff, we look back and we're like, oof.
Yeah, somebody who's not in the Appalachians, like shout out to our Nunnehay Roundtable. That's an excellent episode.
Mm-hmm.
I think you should also listen to that if you're
Yeah.
listeners here. But I think like one issue I've sort of had with the Nunnehay was just because they're so focused on that region, and then there's like these other families from other places, but it sort of gets weirdly sparse feelings. You're like, oh, the local culture here, there's 2 families you could play, unless you're
Yeah.
like moving from, and it starts to get
Yeah, because they wrote from what they researched and knew the best. But yes,
yeah.
it was always kind of in an effort to become more comprehensive, because there are a lot of Nunnehay, like there are a lot of different Nunnehays, but they only highlighted in some ways how many more they needed, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. In Changeling 20th, we sort of modified some of the kiths to be a little bit more universal, to try and be like they could encompass local legends, or they may be known locally as these things, or sort of the Nunnehay were an example of we tried to include a lot, and it only wound up highlighting how much more there was.
Like, I mean, technically it's the same problem you get with running if you're in Europe and you're running a game set in like Poland, but still, yeah.
And we had this problem in C20, when in the C20 players guide, when we were doing the around the world sections. It's like, how do you do Africa in a chapter? Any of the around the world stuff was always tricky. And like that's why I wanted to say, though, I'm like, they really did the best they could, and they really did it in good faith. And I guess that sounds like I'm making excuses, but it's
no, and I don't think we should, like, at least that's not the impression I've gotten either.
Okay.
I'm not saying anyone's going, this is perfect, and there's definitely some of the Changeling books' depiction of the Nunnehay, especially like the brief things, are kind of not great. But
something that stands out to me in this book actually is because we have less of those scattered representations that we get throughout the other books, because they're not kind of weighing against just the write-up of the families. You see a lot more of the human connections and real-world issues being foregrounded, whereas in most of the other books, there's like a throwaway line about Nunnehay raiding parties, and that's all they are. So
yeah, I will say Nunnehay for running LARPs have one big extra problem that I haven't figured out what to do about, where at least here, if I'm running a LARP, it's mostly not Indigenous people playing it.
Yeah.
But you need to have like NPCs. You need to have. It feels different if you're acting things out and dressing up versus a tabletop game where you're just describing things, and that's, you don't want to not have the Nunnehay be a part of it, especially where, like, if I'm setting it like where I am in my own city, that's where a lot of LARPs do. There's definitely a lot of Indigenous people here, so it's some players in the game, but not. It's not going to be a large percentage of them, and it just gets.
And that's one of the huge problems with things in LARP. And as one of my other friends pointed out, he's like, he said he has Indigenous ancestry, but he doesn't look it, as he put it. And he said, so people, if I played a Nunnehay, might make assumptions that aren't actually true. But he's like, at the same time, he's like, I got to tell you, every culture I've seen in any LARP, fantasy LARP, White Wolf, anybody trying to do Indigenous is almost always not Indigenous, and let's just call it not great. And it's like, yeah. I mean, I remember we were in a Gen Con LARP, and one of the Changeling STs decided that she was going to be a Numazoho, one of the giant folk, and she was an Italian girl from Brooklyn. So I'm a Numazoho, and we're like, oh, okay. Like this is
awkward.
Like I don't want people to have to do, ancestry.com tests to check their DNA for what kind of characters they can play, but at the same time,
well, it's also
yikes.
Culturally would be the really where it more like, the only time I've had any Nunnehay in the LARPs I've had was actually a friend of mine who is Indigenous. to the area, and he played a rock giant, but it was his first time I think ever role playing. But he was curious about it, and then he wanted to play one of the Nunnehi, so it was interesting. So it was kind of, but
yeah. And, like I said, it's one of those things where, we talk about like things like the Overton window move and like I just actually had a really big discussion with some LARPers over the weekend where I talked about like, when we look back at a lot of the White Wolf stuff, some of it was not great even back then. And I said, but at the same time, we've got to be careful about holding things up to the standards of now. Like, yes, it is good to revisit them and see where they went wrong.
I'm just thinking about what I'm going to do if I were to run a LARP in 2024 or something. What would I do?
I mean,
I can look at the past as like examples, but not. I mean, the same problem really comes up with the issue.
Yep.
Even if you're talking about the core kiths, it would come up if you had Hissien, if you had the C20 Player's Guide adapted into a LARP, those other kiths.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like, one of the things that we got some heat for C20 was the iconic issue art was me, because the art notes apparently got passed to like, oh, well, it was Dice from the issue kith book.
Mm-hmm.
And I had conveniently written him to currently look like me because I was playing him in a game. And I talked about like how he's taken a number of different disguises over the years or whatever. So they used him because he was an iconic Seokane, except that people are like, why the hell is there a white guy as the issue? And I'm like, I understand your complaint. Like, I played this character. I made this character. And looking back, I'm like, I did it because I was like, well, I want to play my own character in a LARP, so I'm going to say that he currently looks like me, but that wouldn't necessarily have been my choice going forward. I mean, and again, the artists, just followed the art notes they were given. The art notes, came from the developer. So like, I'm not casting shade on anybody, but there was some pushback. And I'm like, yeah, I understand. I did not know that was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. This is also one of those things you really have to know a lot about the cultures involved, and it's not always going to be the same for every culture. But it's also not a thing I think you should just ignore and only have, your European Kithane only or something.
Yeah.
But especially since like I'm in Canada and a lot of the terminology around Indigenous peoples, it's like came out differently as to what's respectful and insulting. So like, plus, it's over 20 years later, things change. So if some of the terminology you'd be using in your game, if you're using this, you might want to talk to people. And
and as I said, it's one of those things where when I was talking to people over the weekend, I was like, it is absolutely fine to hold it up and point out, hey, this is not where we need to be. Like, and I said, but it's also, I want to make sure that people understand that a lot of us, like when I wrote Kith Book Issue, I did a lot of research on Yoruba culture and tradition and legends, and I tried to, honor. And now if I was a developer in 2023, I don't think I'd hire me for that book. I'd want to hire someone who had that as their family experience or their, their life experience, or, somebody who's maybe closer to the material. But it's that kind of push and pull. Like I look at the Nunnehi chapter and I'm like, oh boy,
and you also have like, if you're making a new book now, there's more of a push to stick to what was in the game before. If you're running a game, you should do in terms of what's not going to be insulting to your players and not going to be insulting to thinking about the specific people, not just a book designed for two countries, right? Like, or more, right? This is the kind of thing you need to do more research, more talking to people, more tailoring things, I think, specifically. Like this chapter could have been, no matter how well you do it, I think you did a good job in this. Not that I'm really the expert on what would be a good job for a Nunnehi chapter, but from what I know, it seems like you did a good job. But it was 20 years ago, and it is, especially for this, it's going to really vary a lot by region. So
it is something, like I said, it is something that we have to be mindful of. And ultimately for Shining Host Player's Guide, like I said, for me, this was just my attempt to get everything I couldn't cram into book one into LARP. Also, I wanted to give as many people as many different options to play Changeling as I could. And like I wanted, so in anime, great, in Nunnehi, great, like, just more character types, more personalization, more customization, more options. I really wanted to try and bring the breadth of Changeling, and I knew we weren't likely to get a third book. I knew it was very unlikely we got this one, and so I had a real feeling of I've got to pile everything in here I can.
Yeah, that's been a lot of Changeling books.
I mean, because we only had 4 of the old Mind's Eye Theater books that had Changeling content, because Laws of Judgment had the Changeling endings, of course. But it was Shining Host, Shining Host Player's Guide, Laws of the Hunt Revised, and Laws of Judgment. Those are the 4 books that have Changeling material in them. So, I wanted to get as much in there as I could, and I wanted to kind of let what Nikki and Jackie had done, speak for itself, as it were, for the Nunnehe, but I tried to just, get as much in there as I could. So,
did you have anything, Puka? Or
just that there were a couple things that caught my eye, which I was trying to remember if they were from the Player's Guide, if they had been adapted, or if they were created for this book. So in particular, it stood out to me that the way that the Nunnehi became changelings is sort of has nothing to do with the shattering, in the sense of like when colonization happened and when the Kithane came and everything. It was just something in their deep history where they made a pact with some of the elders to begin incarnating. And I was like, oh, I like that that's spelled out here. The other piece was there's a bit about how, in addition to shifting camp allegiances between summer and winter and mid-season, the Nunnehi are often kind of affiliated with one or more secret societies that change regularly. And I was like, I would like to hear more about this. So, yeah. And the Thought Crafters are in here too, so
yeah, I tried to grab every extant thing I could and put them in there. And again, with no disrespect intended to the original material, we also tried to keep things very clear and straightforward. Since we had to condense so much, we had to kind of lay everything out that was sometimes hinted at or alluded to or otherwise.
You also had a few years of hindsight to do that too, so that helped.
Can I kick off a discussion of Chapter 2 by saying that I love this turn of the millennium Photoshop action that's happening on this photograph?
Yeah.
Maybe not even Photoshop. This is like Cottingley Fairy collage kind of thing almost.
Yeah, we had some ongoing issues. Like, I'm not going to cast shade on the art design or anything, but it was weird because we had some really talented photographers who took a lot of photos from our playtest game and did some good Photoshop work with them and things like that, and like tried to submit them, and they were like, no, we've got our own people. And then some of these images, I'm like, that? Like, well, I could see sometimes it was a different direction, and I'm like, okay, but like, okay. I stay out of the art department, they stay out of the editing department, but
there you go. Well, so we are entering the anime in this chapter.
Yep, which does not have the same cultural issues with playing an anime.
No, which is good, yeah. There's lots of little bits in here, actually, which I imagine that playing an anime in a LARP has a different feel. Well, I'm sure all of them feel different in LARP settings, but the anime in particular, because I imagine a lot of LARP games are happening outdoors in natural environments, and being in that space, if you're playing a Kubera or an Ondine in the pool or whatever, like you have a lot more to work with to really make it feel like the world and the concerns of the anime are directly involved with the Kithane side of things. But
yeah, the thing about an anime players is I've almost never met anyone who played one in tabletop, but they're consistently popular in LARP. There's not many of them, but in the games I've seen, there's usually 1 or 2 people who want to play one. And the people who do play them really weird and alien. They really do feel different than regular Kithane.
I've actually never encountered one, PC or NPC. I just never.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Mannikins in particular are, I think, way more interesting here than they are in an anime The Secret Way, in part because they actually have birthrights and frailties here. But
that was an editorial decision on my part.
But like the Velveteen Dreams thing and the Spark of Life frailty, so wanting to be human and the Uncanny Valley effect, both of those are story hooks that can go in so many directions, I feel like, and that's great because I feel like now I know how I could play a mannequin by reading this description.
Although it does highlight that you can totally play Commander Data as a mannequin.
For sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's like a goal.
We had a mannequin player who was genuinely unsettling, and in a very good way. They hit that Uncanny Valley really well, and everyone liked them, but they were always a little bit creeped out by them. And I feel like that's exactly where Mannikins should be a lot of the time. I always really liked in anime, so I tried to jazz them up a little bit. No, in no way when I'm doing all these am I trying to cast shade on the tabletop writers. It was more like, how do we make this more LARPable and interesting for LARPers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like you said, like giving Mannikins the birthright and frailty made them a lot more approachable and interesting.
Like I've in my LARP games, I've pulled things from tabletop that are not in one of these books, and for my tabletop games, I pulled LARP things into it for various reasons too. So like it's fine to do that too. But yeah, this is LARP focused, so.
Yeah, and like we talked about like last time with the Shining Host, the original Shining Host book, like a lot of people took the blended Kith merit and took it to tabletop because they're like, oh my god, I really love this. Where you can take something from another Kith and your legend is a little bit different. You're born from a slightly different story. And, people really like those in the LARP, and I know so many people who just took them straight over to tabletop. And with the anime, I tried to make them feel really weird and different because I didn't want them to just seem like extra Kiths that are elemental Kiths, but like really, truly strange.
Well, you very specifically set up Glade and Croft as courts, which, even though there is kind of that hint of it in the tabletop book, I don't think they're ever actually spelled out as political entities in and of themselves, separate from the empires. And so that was an interesting thing.
Yeah, we pulled that out to try and get more sense of conflict and more division in their society and give them so they don't. One of the things it always is weird to me is a lot of times in game supplements, and I don't mean just like White Wolf, but in general, whenever a new group is introduced, they're a monoculture because it makes it easier to plug them into a game if they're all basically the same.
That's not just role-playing games, even like fantasy and science fiction does that all over the place.
Oh yeah, the monoculture, like all Vulcans are logical, all Klingons are warriors.
All Vulcans speak the same language.
Yeah, true. And like, when you're introducing a lot of stuff, shorthand is useful. When people are trying to navigate a fantasy world or a high science fiction world, having commonalities is good, but it does get a little tiresome every once in a while. And that's why I like the characters who wind up breaking those become some of the most popular characters. I think the characters who aren't what we expect from that culture. Once we've established all the Klingons are like this, well, we have a Klingon who's not like this, and that makes them interesting. Or we have a Cardassian who's a tailor. That's probably fine. What harm could he do? But I tried to make it so that they had their own divisions. It also explains why they don't always show up. They have their own politics. They've got their own society. They're not sitting around waiting to interact with Cathane. That's not.
If you ever ran your 200-person Changeling LARP that was running every month or weekly, the 20 in anime player characters would be totally have their own internal politics.
But see, you say that, and yet I do also really like how the Heart Riddle in particular gets its own sidebar and gets foregrounded and gives a compelling reason why an anime might approach the more fleshy Fae in the first place. Because it's like, you humans are fascinating.
Yeah, but like for like the Heart Riddle, I zeroed in on that when I read an anime because I'm like, this is what you need to have them interact. Like this is what they need to and like also whenever source books and things introduce new elements, is like, why haven't we seen them before? And sometimes we just kind of ignore that because that's a conceit of gaming, that things are just going to get retconned in, or more books come out over the years. But I'm like, I always liked it when there was a reason why sometimes they won't approach you, or this is why we don't see them very often. They've got their own thing going on, and if they want to interact with us, this is probably why.
And that helps further craft the kinds of stories that a LARP could get involved with.
Yeah, I mean, there was a subplot in a Changeling game I was a player in for a while that was a delegation of an anime arrived at court, and because the Changelings we had lobbied to like preserve a park to create, because we were going to put a balefire there and create a new freehold, and the inanimate said, "Oh, thank you for preserving this. This is ours." And we went, "Oh." And things got very tense, and they said, we appreciate you preserving this land. It's ours, and we're going to And we eventually talked them into turning it into an embassy, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But it threw everything upside down, and people are like, "Where did you come from?" And like, "Where did you come from? we were always been here." So that was a fun contrast to have the different, an anime show up and have their own politics. And then the Glade and anime were furious that we were going to develop the land at all and put a freehold or anything in there. And then they had a couple of Croft in their delegation who were like, no, let us talk to them. We understand them better. Which is funny because they were still space aliens. They still had no idea how a lot of things work. But they were slightly better at talking to the changelings than the Glade in anime, who were really just weird.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a fun storyline.
I have two random questions. Just one is an oblique connection to C20. Something we talked about when we went through the tabletop book was how slumber checks seem to presage banality checks. And I wondered, because they pop up here again, was that the case?
Yeah, it was a concept that was kicking around for a while, and I think this is when we were starting to try it out because we really liked that concept as part of Changeling, and this was a good way to start playing with it more because it's expressly written into the anime that they have these sorts of checks, and we're like, what if we had these sort of for regular changelings, like that their nature just sleeps for a while? Because in Changeling, as was written in first edition, it was basically once you awakened as a changeling, you were a changeling until your banality burned you out, and that was it.
Yeah.
And occasionally some people might forget for a little while, but usually it was you lived gloriously for a little while and that was it. That was definitely part of the concept of the game, but that's not as satisfying or sustainable for a lot of gamers.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great stylistic choice, but it's not a really good way to build long-running stories. The sort of Mayfly effect that Changeling was originally kind of written to.
Well, then they should just make a new character.
Yeah, exactly. But, or how do you have games that take place over long periods of time and have characters? It was kind of unfeasible. It was sort of like, as we got older, we also were like, I don't think everyone over the age of 25 is hopelessly doomed to banality.
I mean, they also had, when you actually read, not the description of the rules or the little bits that talk about how people age or whatever, but when you actually look at the characters you get, the plot lines you get, the meta plot you get, it didn't fit that either.
Yeah,
those Fae were way more durable from banality than
She monarchs hanging on for 50 years. And
and just a bunch of commoners still lasting years. And
that was always a contrast, because if you played rules as written, changelings would be done from banality so quickly, and yet we have characters in the fiction, and I always like it when fiction should match the game. If you have game fiction, the characters in the fiction should operate the same way as the characters in the game. And there was always a little bit of weirdness with that because the White Wolf anthologies usually came out before the game because they were trying to stir up interest. Like Splendor Falls, the Changeling anthology, came out before first edition Changeling. So some of it does not work at all like Changeling because the authors had a rough outline that they were given, or some of them really just had kind of a very basic. So they riffed on it, and so you had stuff that never showed up in game. I remember being really mad that it took a very long time to get dream magic in Changeling, because one of the best stories in Splendor Falls is about a neuromancer, essentially. And
plus, it's called Changeling the Dreaming.
Exactly. It seemed like the most obvious magic. Like, fairies are constantly putting people to sleep and messing with their dreams and doing all this other, So
and if you're talking about story potentials, I think if the threat of banality and the threat of bedlam, if that feels real to the players, you're doing fine, I think. It doesn't have to knock them out.
Or the threat of slumber.
And there's a certain balance to that, because you want those to be elements of the game, or Changeling loses some of its teeth. If people aren't afraid of bedlam or banality, then they're missing some of the essential dynamic of the game. It's like playing Vampire and not caring about humanity. You're missing a huge part of what makes the game what it's supposed to be.
Which it must be said, plenty of people do.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing. At that point, and this is my little chip on my shoulder type thing, is as you get further into Vampire, it became more and more of a supernatural political thriller and less of a personal horror game. So,
and we'll get it to later chapters. This book, The Shining House Player's Guide, actually helps you with political thriller games too, or political in a way that feels more natural. But yes, it's
Speaking of said scenarios,
The Shadow Court?
Yes.
My favorite chapter.
This starts out, I think there's some sort of conspiracy here, because it says the narrator is named Simon Victor, and that's the first names of the people who did Walking Away from Arcadia, and I think we need to wake up sheeple. Anyway, let's continue.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, Simon Victor was my friend Andy, and that was his Sluagh character, and so he was. Yeah, he's in the credits. He's in the playtesting credits. There was a Changeling game that plays in northern Delaware. It had a revival a few years ago. Winter's Edge was what it was called. It was southern Pennsylvania, northern Delaware, southern New Jersey. It's actually where Steve Grabania, the person who invented the Jester's Rules bunking stuff, that's his game. He was the ST for a long time. And my friend Andy was one of the Shadow Court. And that was his character. Simon was one of the Shadow Court. And so he was really good at it, because a lot of the Shadow Court, it's like the Sabbat infiltrators in a Cam Vampire game. Like, everybody knows who they are almost immediately. And LARPers are bad at secrets, which can be fine. But with the Shadow Court, he did it so well because he was a Sluagh and he was a little sinister, so people would whisper about it, so to speak. But he was very good at covering his tracks. And he was one of the first Shadow Court members I actually saw who was really good at being subtle and having plausible deniability for everything that he did. So he got the honor of being our narrator.
Which was a wise choice, I think, compared with the Shadow Court tabletop book. Like, it really came to life the way that it's written here. Even though it's a lot of it is the same material, I felt like I was able to grasp it a lot better when it was presented in this voice.
Yeah, like if I were to run a tabletop game and have all or some of the player characters play Shadow Court, and I was going to read, like, I think this would be the best chapter to read on it.
The thing is, like, a bunch of us played Court for a while in a large game, and so we got to do the ins and outs, and we even had some of the characters from the different factions in our Shadow Court, so we weren't all interested in the same thing, and everyone lumped us in together because it became, after a while, it became an open secret. Sometimes due to people metagaming, and sometimes due to finding out in character or whatever. But I was one of the front characters who everybody knew, so I was a distraction. I was my Puka, Blackberry Jack.
Yeah, that made me laugh because he's describing a large chunk of this chapter.
Yeah,
of how society works. I'm like, wait, can I trust any of this?
Yep, that was the idea.
That section did actually make me care about the political impulses for the first time. So,
yep.
And that's the thing, is the Shadow Court, and like we would go on to really reinvent them for C20, but I was already kind of going towards the reinvention, because the Shadow Court book was really cool in a lot of ways, and I really liked it, but it was very hard to play in a lot of ways too, because the Shadow Court was so, either they were completely ceremonial or they were like Sabbat and they couldn't coexist. And I was like, we need more of a middle ground here for this. So that's why I dove into the politics a bit more, to make them a little more complex, so they're not just these mustache twirling villains, or they're not simply kids throwing rocks on mischief night. They become the most detailed and broad secret society in Changeling, as opposed to among the Kithane, as opposed to like the Sabbat. Yeah, it's like somewhere between, in vampire terms, Sabbat, independent Bruja, like that type of thing. One of the things that always really got to me about Vampire, which was really great for tabletop but not great for LARP, is that the factions really couldn't coexist. You can't have Cam and Sabbat coexist in a city, generally speaking. One will fight the other. They will wipe each other out. And even with the Anarchs and the independent clans and things, like, if you wanted to play like a Sabbat character in a Cam game, that could be really interesting, except there's no reason you would survive. They would kill you. They would have to. Or vice versa. Yeah. And like, but I always thought it would be interesting to have like a Lazambra who follows Path of Power in the Inner Voice as the seneschal to a Camarilla prince, Camarilla prince. Yeah, and the fact that you see that showing up in LARPs, people doing that kind of thing, shows that like the players wanted it. Yeah, because with LARP, you have to be able to mingle. You have to, in tabletop, these extreme factions and alliances and rivalries work okay because it's a small group of people. But in LARP, if you want to have a diverse LARP of characters with a lot of motivations, the societies and the political groups need to be able to get along. Yeah, you need, if you're designing your own LARP setting, you need a whole bunch of different groups of people that dislike each other but will show up to parties together. That's the Yeah, and that's the thing. It's one of the things when we designed Requiem, we tried so hard to make the different, the clans and the covenants could coexist. Some of the covenants really hate each other, but they can all coexist. None of them are a kill on sight for the others necessarily, because we were trying to get away from the Cam Sabat, like it's all or nothing, and we wanted to have like, you guys may hate each other, but you can coexist in a city. And that was the same thing, is like, if everyone knows the Shadow Court sacrifice people and or run by the Thalane, at the deepest level or whatever, then why would you ever let them in your town? And so we wanted to have some diversity for the Shadow Court. And plus, I loved a lot of their concepts. I wanted to really dive into we're not just waving our hands and being, waving our fists in the air. They've got some interesting points of view. Yeah, some of them are rock throwers and bomb throwers, but a lot of them have some valid points. Like the whole, like, the Sealy rule of several hundred years is really kind of bullshit, and we really shouldn't do that. I could see that being sympathetic, and Cathane being like, you know what? Yeah, like. Now I guess, to use our modern terminology, like, how does the Shadow Court radicalize people? And I feel like we needed to have it be like, why would anyone join an organization if it was only just, yes, we are pure evil and we serve darkness and we sacrifice Cathane with cold iron blades? No one's going to join that group. I mean, okay, somebody will, but most people are not going to be like,
you don't want them all in your LARP anyway, the people who join.
yeah, exactly. And like, who gets up and looks at, sees a pamphlet on the bulletin board at the grocery store, is like, do you want to be evil? Join us. And be like, you know what? Evil. That's what I've been missing. Like,
well, as kind of a meta question following that, when you've had the Shadow Court in a game, I mean, in particular, so the C20 version that you're pointing to, even though it's kind of recast on those lines, I think like the mustache twirling evil still kind of is in the air. So how do you kind of pull the Shadow Court out of that if you have players showing up and like that's what they want to do?
Well,
or do you let them do that?
In something like that, if players showed up and wanted to play things like that in my game, like real hardcore Black Court, Shadow Court, to use the C20 term, like the real evildoers and the puppet masters, usually what I would tell a player who wanted to play a character like that is, you're on a clock. You are not going to last. And when they find out, I will not save you. I will not protect you. Whatever they do to you, you have to understand is fair game, because you have chosen to play a character who is actively against what most other characters can tolerate. And when they find out, whatever they do, you don't get to complain, basically. If you're okay with that, I like having some subterfuge. I like having some intrigue in games and things. But if they rumble you and they catch you, I'm not going to step in as an ST and be like, okay, guys, well, it's their character, so let's not go too nuts.
I've actually seen it though in LARPs I've been in, where the Shadow Court are doing a good job, like they are in the background manipulating type.
Yeah,
and then they get exposed, and like a third of the player characters are sticking up for them, and it's
yeah. That's why it was important to have the different factions of the court, because again, like, some of them seem very reasonable, and some of them are, I think, relatively reasonable, and that makes them better villains.
Yeah, and it's not like the regular Cathane are super nice, completely law-abiding, very like everyone gets along, like it's not.
And that's one of the things we wanted to also make clear, is that there's a difference between the people who are unseelie and people who are Shadow Court. Shadow Court is a hard choice. Even the relatively, quote, surface level court, like the ones who are more into overt vandalism, or the easier ones to spot, because they're but usually also the least sinister, because they're just disruptive as opposed to being like Machiavellian. I said even they have a point, and you can understand why they get there. But we also wanted to make sure, like, if you join the court, socially, that changes. When people find that out, that's a thing that they will respond to. It's not the same as Sealy or unsealy. It is, you're unsealy with an agenda and a grudge, and you are going to go way beyond the usual Sealy unsealy slap fighting that happens in a lot of games.
Well, like one game I played in, a Slua she was Shadow Court ritualist, And like she threw a great Beltane party that everybody loved.
Yeah. The Shadow Court were usually the hosts of our Samhain parties, but then one time they decided to throw the Beltane party, and everyone's like, "Why?" And they're like, "Oh no reason." And then they collected blackmail on everyone.
Yeah,
you know, like it's sort of with the Shadow Court. Like, I guess we didn't have these terms obviously at the time. It's like, for me, it was always about kind of like what I've heard called like the Killmonger effect, which is like a good villain should have a point that the audience goes, "Huh." Like, I don't like their methods, but like until you drill really deep down into the Shadow Court and get to the really awful Thelain and so forth, like you can find yourself nodding along with them more than you might like, and that's what makes them dangerous. So,
no, this chapter does have the Thalains.
oh yeah,
doesn't say anything about not playing them or anything.
Yep.
It's still...
It must be so much fun to do a beastie costume.
My favorite was, we were at Gen Con one year, and there were several Thelain whose characters were based on the Justice League. Don't ask. But the beastie was Aquaman, and he would turn into a fish and just sort of flop around, and people would scream and run in terror because of his beastie form. And it was one of the most changeling things I've ever experienced, because someone was like, "A suffocating fish, run!" And just, as he flops around on the ground trying to breathe.
Excellent.
Yeah, because the other thing is, I knew there's no use fighting people wanting to play Thelain.
Mm-hmm.
They're gonna play Thelain. There was a concept in a Changeling game that my wife and I ran that we tried to get into C20 and didn't quite make. We wanted to have Sorcha, which is Gaelic for bright one. And these were Seelie who ritually removed their unseelie side. So sort of the anti-Thelain. They burned their unseelie side away with cold iron, so they just had a Seelie legacy and a bright legacy, which was their extremely unsettling, super Seelie, dangerous, just like the Thelain have their legacy. And these were Seelie who responded to the spread of corruption and vice and licentiousness by burning their unseelie side away. They didn't quite make the cut, which made me sad, because I really loved the
Storyteller's Vault.
Yeah, I've thought about it, because they were really fun and they were really messed up. And there's a picture from Gen Con I was playing a Seelie Duke, and I was an absolute jerk. And the unseelie like made a picket sign that said "Seelie does not mean nice," and it became a mantra in all of our Changeling games. Because it really doesn't. It is not good and evil. It is not an equation like that. But yeah, so we created the bright ones as a counter move once the Thelain became public in C20, and they became more open than they used to be. These people reacted by saying no, never. And yeah, so they were big on purity.
Gross.
Storyteller's Vault. Okay, fair enough.
So yeah, do we want to move on to the Kinane and Enchanted chapter?
Let's do. It was refreshing to read through this chapter, because C20, I know that we've talked before about how the way enchantment and Kinane have been rendered in C20, I'm kind of dissatisfied, just because the Enchanted is one of my favorite books ever, and I'm like, I just wanted that.
I really love the Enchanted.
So
yeah, enchantment rules and Kinane rules are one of the big ones for me of not using C20.
No, I understand. Like, I love the Kinane, and it came a lot from, we had a werewolf game that actually ran Kinfolk really well, and that inspired a lot of how we looked at the LARP version. I love the Enchanted. I absolutely loved the idea, Fey-blooded characters and Kinane and enchanted mortals and so forth, because it adds so much. And it's also, one of my friends put it, he's like, this is the perfect like boyfriend who came to the LARP character. Like your friend who just shows up.
I think the enchanted mortal is the perfect one for that.
Yeah, and they're like, if your friend shows up and wants to just try the game out, like an enchanted mortal or a Kinane is like a Kinane relative of one of the characters, or just an enchanted mortal is a great starter character. But I've also known people who've played them for full long-term chronicles and really enjoyed it, because they have a different point of view. We tried to smooth some of their difficulties interacting with the Changeling world, because we're like, at a LARP, most of those things won't matter. Because in tabletop, a mortal staying enchanted for days on end can be an issue.
Yep.
But most LARPs are a single night, and that's easy. So like we have to sort of shift how they work a little bit. Otherwise, it doesn't quite hit the same. It's sort of like, powers in LARP. you have to factor might affect a room full of player characters that is like 20 people if you use scene and and you start using arts that in a tabletop game you're going to affect 3 or 4 other PCs. In LARP you could affect 20 or 30, and so you have to sort of keep things in mind. And with the Kinane it was similar. It's like how are we going to make it easy to play these characters but also still have some of their downsides or something that makes them not seem like full Kithane. They have to feel different.
And I will say, like, just like the other books we said for the other chapters, like, I do like Enchanted, but I think this book does a clearer description of summarizing what's in Enchanted. Like,
we had the benefit of hindsight, like you said.
Exactly,
And
but just thought I'd mention it again, especially people people, if you're not into LARP, but you're curious about these things, you might want to check out the C20 Players Guide.
And that's we like that too, because also again we had to have brevity. We had to try and be clear and quick and go through these concepts. This book was, I think it wound up being 30,000 words longer than it was supposed to, because I just kept adding stuff, and Cynthia was very nice about it, but I just kept adding things and adding things and adding things. And like when it came to the Kinane, she basically was like, okay, these are not prime characters necessarily. These are support characters. So this one's one of the shorter ones because of that. It's like, we're not spending a ton of time on this because these are not going to be a popular character type. I said, okay.
Or they don't need as much either.
No, that's the thing. They don't need as much either.
Nevertheless, there's some stuff in here which is, to my knowledge, not anywhere else in the game line. The primary thing probably being the sidebar on becoming Kithane.
I will say it missed one detail that was like in my brain screaming, going, or they could become like a she.
Yeah,
because one of the she return and take over.
Yeah, we actually talked about that. Like, if we'd had the autumn she, we probably would have done something like that, just because we would have the contrast. We could have like, you could become an Arcadian she if you became a host.
Yeah, but you're a new character now, like, essentially.
Yeah, and like I said to Ian when we were working on C20, I'm like, man, it would have been fun to have like, what if you had like Kinane families that offered themselves as hosts to the she, and like, they prepared the child, and the child went to the woods and they did a rite, and the she took their body, sort of thing. And he's like, oh, that's awesome. I don't think we have room for that. But I was like,
storytellers.
But yeah, the becoming Kithane was also because it was what if your friend who showed up and played a couple games as the Enchanted Mortal likes his character and wants to stay, surprise, he was a changeling. He just was really asleep, or really, like, can you promote this character so that he feels like he can still play? So it was kind of a LARP reality that I thought also just worked with a lot of changeling lore or fairy tale lore, is that sometimes they do take you and make you one of them. But yeah, that was definitely one that I slipped past Cynthia because I knew she would say no, so I just didn't call attention to it, and I just kind of slipped that in the draft.
But you also have a very elegant way to do it when you have the reference to like the sword in the stone and having that item with a fairy essence bound into it, choosing someone to become Kithane. I think that's a very quick and easy way to slip that into a game.
Yeah, and that built off the fact that like I always liked the bound essence trait from the first one, where it's like your fairy nature is like a Selkie code. It's bound into an item. I had a player once who had an actor's copy of Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream, like an original actor's copy from Shakespeare, and that was what gave them their fairy nature. And I always thought that was one of the coolest uses of bound essence. But yeah, I just like I said, a lot of what it was is trying to give people more options, and also trying to recognize, like your friend showed up, he played a couple games, like, this is pretty cool. Do I have to make a new character? Like, nah, we can promote you. Like we can work this out. We can make this character a full fae. Here's how we do it.
As kind of a side thing to that, another part of this chapter that I really like is that just all in one place you have the kith by kith descriptions of what Kinane are like and how they interact with their full Kithane cousins.
Yeah.
So in a game, does that come up often where, if one person's playing a Kinane, everyone kind of treats them the way they would treat a Kinane in general, but then it's like, oh, you're a Boggin Kinane, the player who's a full Boggin is going to interact with you in a maybe more specific kind of way. it almost kind of creates dyads within the dynamics of the LARP, I imagine.
Yeah, and usually what we would do is I put those sections in there so that when somebody showed up to play and played a Kinane, you would go to the players of the existing Kith and be like, by the way, this is how these people are usually perceived by your people. And you can go with that or not. I mean, you don't have to follow that advice, but to give it a sense of the Kith culture, because most of the Changeling Kiths have such a strong culture.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one of the things I love about them. It's one of the things that Changeling players have consistently loved and adopted. And the only other White Wolf game that I think quite gets to that level is Vampire, and that's a lot due to age. Like the clans have very specific fan culture, and clan culture is a thing in a way that like mage traditions and werewolf tribes never quite manifested, but Changeling Kiths very much do. Also,
well, yeah, like I've had so much experience. Somebody's never heard of Changeling. They're interested in it. You pull out the list of Kiths, and they're like, "Oh, that's me."
Yep.
Pointing to one of them.
My wife says, like when the reason that she wanted to work on Kithbook Boggin is Boggins always know each other. Like players who identify with Boggins know each other immediately. Like more than I think almost any other Kith. Like people who, as real life people, identify with Boggins always find each other. They're just like that.
Whereas Puka merely suspect each other.
Yeah. Knocker type people always do that too. Just they don't get along so well.
Yeah. And like we wanted also to make the Kinane feel like they're part of the culture, even if that part of the culture isn't a very good part a lot of the time. Like some of the Kiths treat their Kinane pretty badly. Some of them love them, some of them don't. So like getting an idea, because one of my friends was like, well, he's like, I get that the red caps often don't, but like red caps I feel like would bond really tightly. I'm like, well, yeah. Even red cap Kinane, because nobody likes them. It's the Philadelphia sports thing. No one likes us. We don't care. That's red caps in a nutshell. So yeah, again, it was a lot about options and just trying to, because the Kinane and the Enchanted Mortals were consistently, like I said, the starter characters for people who were trying out the game or dipping their toe in the water, or somebody's friend who got brought along for a night. And it's like, why don't we try and write in ways that can make that more fun? And you could play them long term if you want, but they're not just an afterthought. They're not just like they're. And again, The Enchanted was such a beautiful book, and I loved it so much.
Yeah.
And it sort of got left behind by the rest of Changeling. The concepts from Enchanted rarely get mentioned ever again in the tabletop books. Like they just don't carry over.
But I will say, because most of our listeners have arrived to the game with C20, even though this is an older book, like everything in here about the Kinane and the Enchanted, I think is very valuable. I mean, the Fey gifts and stuff you might not need with the C20 mechanics, but all of the sort of narrative stuff is so valuable because, like you're saying, it doesn't really come up anywhere else since the Enchanted.
Yeah, and the Old World of Darkness, I mean, the way that we wrote it, the way that it was developed, it was a large, rambunctious family, but we didn't always communicate. And so that meant that certain concepts would just sort of get dropped from games or never go anywhere. Because there was no central continuity, hub exactly. Like there were people at White Wolf who had a good idea of continuity. And if you did something, you would have to go to whoever the lead dev was at the time. Like if you were doing a vampire thing, you checked with Justin. But no one was really cross-checking, so there wasn't a lot of continuity management. And so some of the stuff from the books just got dropped and never went anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we have on page 139 Enchanted Very Best Doggo as an option as well.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that that's ever come up anywhere else again, but I'm here for it.
I'm a little bit confused how you bring that into a LARP.
We had a person who played a dog.
Oh, okay. That's
so absolutely amazing at it. And they were an enchanted dog, and they just had a blast. And they came to like 3 games, and they were just the goodest boy. And
so that's the third option if somebody brings their boyfriend or something to the game. It's like, do you want to play the dog?
And also, fairy stories are full of enchanted animals and things. And as it says, like animals are generally kind of like, oh, okay. They don't have our mundane view, so they're kind of like, cool, new friends.
Again, if you're just into this for tabletop, that's another thing to check out from this book for you.
I do recommend it, because as much as I understood the direction we took in C20, and I can talk about that, I just have a soft spot for the Enchanted like the old school Enchanted. So
yeah. And there's little pieces which make Changeling feel distinct, which I always appreciate. So when we did our dive into that book, into the Enchanted, I think I pointed out one of my favorite pieces was that there are separate Fey gifts for speaking to the dead and seeing the dead. I love that. I love that it's not like, no, it's just all one necromancy power. It's like, no, you have to earn both of those aspects.
Yep.
And people might point to that and say, like, well, that's not powerful enough, or that makes no sense. Why do I have to buy two separate things? But it adds a distinctive aspect to the world about how changelings interact with ghosts. It ties into like Irish myth and everything.
Yep.
And I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So
here we go.
Arts.
Yeah, when we're talking about the arts chapter, like a lot of this is drawn from Blood Dim Tides, because we have Aphrodisia, for example, which was another art that Changelings I thought should have had a lot sooner, as like an emotion art, as it were.
I do want to say also, this is my favorite photo in this book.
Oh, the shrinking room.
I wonder that must have been. It feels like that was somebody like had a weird LARP space or something.
Well,
like,
and the thing was, like, that was another one where, like I said before, and again, no shade to the original artist and director, but this was similar to a picture that my group had sent in.
Weird.
Yeah, we had a few things like that where I think, to a degree, I think it was just similar subject matter, but like, or the Shadow Court chapter picture, one of the characters looks exactly like a friend of mine who posed for some of the pictures who was in our Shadow Court, but it's not them. It's not them at all. So there was actually some tension because, and it boiled over like in the Laws of the Reckoning book. My friend who was a photographer, they wound up recreating some of her shots almost exactly. And I had them go back and give her a credit, and like they wound up paying her at least a nominal amount because they had basically just remade some of her photos.
So was there like a stable of people used for like all the LARP books or something?
But for playtesting or for
art? For pictures, for the art, for the photo, because like all the LARP books like were always photos of people.
Yeah, and which was that was a big choice, is they wanted to show people, which is why some of the photos are weird, like the anime one with like a person in a tree. It's kind of like we wanted to show the game as it would be played, so we wanted to have photos of people as much as possible rather than illustrations or things like that. Like, like some people would be underwhelmed by the photos in Mind's Eye Theater books. Is like, but we're trying to show people what they can actually expect to see and play.
Until we're recorded here, I thought all the art from all the Mind's Eye Theater books was like from the playtesters.
Nope. Nope. Although, like I said, that was sort of a sticking point eventually with my group, because my photographers, like, they keep doing things that look like photos I've sent. And like, I mean, you do see sometimes in Mind's Eye Theater books with certain authors or certain artists carry across multiples, and I'm like, that's okay, that is probably the playtesters, other local group, and people are posing because there are some models that carry over from book to book.
I thought I recognized some faces from like House of the Night, but maybe not.
And the other thing too is like looking back now with the arts in this, I really went way overboard. These are so long. A lot of these arts, the write-ups are so long, and like, I tried to keep Mind's Eye Theater short and sweet, and I did not live up to that in this.
Yeah, I do have to say, of the chapters here, this is the one that's like, I'm like that with any big list of powers, though.
Yeah, and that's the thing. But I was like, wow, this is really, some of these descriptions and the rules are way too complex. Like, part of it was also, we were being told at this point in Mind's Eye Theater that our rules were too easy to exploit by like members of like what was the Camarilla, the Mind's Eye Society,
group network play.
Network play people were like, these powers, they're too short, they're too open-ended. Please put in some more language, like to prevent cheating, essentially, or to more clearly define them. And I'm like, Changeling magic isn't really clearly defined a lot of the time, but so you can see that shift in some of the Mind's Eye Theater books. The powers tend to get longer because we're supposed to try and explain very specifically how they work, how they don't work, have things in there, included as anti-cheating statements. I'm not blaming the Camarilla for it or the Mind's Eye Society. I'm just
a lot of different games. Sometimes I think when it was like several hundred, maybe separate independent games that were all in the same network and had to let people move between them and stuff like that. That's a very different requirement than like getting 30 people together in your local area to play in the LARP.
That was one of the main sources of friction throughout my career as a Mind's Eye author, and then later as the Mind's Eye developers. I wrote books for groups that looked like mine, which was 20 or 30 friends getting together and playing. And so I don't really write to try and avoid cheating because we would always just say no. If somebody was like, well, technically the book allows me to do this, well, we don't want you to, but it's in the rules. I don't care. You're doing it to ruin everyone's time. We're not doing it.
Even then, like, I know, like in Ottawa before I moved here, like there was a LARP with like 200 players, but that's still, you could still do that because you still have the consistent storyteller team. You don't have the different storyteller teams trying to adjudicate players moving between them and interactions.
Yeah, and I said, LARP is always going to be an honor system at a certain level because you're not around a table where a GM is watching you the entire time and also available to answer questions. Players are going to make decisions on the fly. And yeah, a lot of players will call for a narrator or an ST if they have a question, but like players will sometimes make bad calls because they think the rule works that way and no one else knows different.
Especially if no one's disagreeing. If everyone's present, it's like, that sounds cool.
And I said, for a long time, I was like, if it's an honor code anyway, then what are we doing? It's trying to write powers that you can't break. First of all, that's never going to work. But with some of these, some of these just got out of control. I mean, I like the basic concepts. Like Changeling should have weather powers. That's overdue. Changeling should have emotion powers. That's overdue. They're shape-shifting. Like the whole metamorphosis art of like, only having shape-shifting as one part of primal before was very limiting considering how often Fae change shape in stories. So
and this is a different take than C20 where the number of cantrips doing these kind of things are the same, but they're spread across more arts.
Yeah, they got more specific. Like the core rulebook had relatively general arts, and the source books had increasingly specific art. It's the Tremere effect, only for changelings. Where it's like we have blood magic, and then 5 books later we have the path of this. It's to make computers made out of blood or something. I don't know. The Tremere got real weird. And their thaumaturgy paths got real specific.
Yeah, I am curious how often infusion has come up not in downtime, but like in an actual session.
More than you'd think, but I always had a lot of knockers in my games. So,
well, not but just like doing the long-term crafting stuff. But anyway, in a session.
Oh, yeah. That was the other tricky thing is infusion is supposed to be the crafting art, but it was never really clearly detailed how that works.
Yeah.
And that's something we grappled with in C20. We tried to finally nail it down and be like, this is how you make enchanted items. This is how you make chimerical items. Like this is how crafting works for the Fae, because it was never ever explained well. Because they're like, wait, so if I make chimera, if my knocker makes a sword or something, do I have to buy that as a background now? Like, because I made it as a sword and now I have a chimera, and like, it was never really clear. Like, when do I need infusion? When don't I? Like,
to me, it should always be you could do it without infusion, but it's way easier with it.
Yes, that was how we wound up handling it. Or infusion is for the stuff that is like mad science or steampunk or alchemy. Like it's the stuff like that you couldn't do by normal means, or you could do the normal things much faster, and you can do the things that are simply not possible, quote unquote, with conventional crafting or chemistry or whatever. That was infusion. And so that was usually how we drew the line. That seemed to work okay because people could still do some crafting and things, and if they wanted to be really good at it, they would take infusion, which was also a signal to me as an ST that this is heading my way. When someone starts taking infusion, I have to start getting ready. But yeah, that was also another one where I'm skimming all the books, the source books that were out at the time, and like grabbing the arts that were here in Blood Dim Tides or Kithbook Knocker, and just like trying to standardize them. And there were a lot of people who were really mad that infusion was no longer knocker specific.
Which is the case for a lot of these arts too, right? Like it seems like a lot of them are, this is more common for this kith and this kith, which I couldn't remember if that was in the core book.
Which was a nod to like where they came from, because originally infusion was the knocker secret art.
Yeah.
And yeah, some of the arts were associated more with different Fae than others, but
and not having merfolk in here, you have to change those at least. But.
Yeah, this is only available by the characters you have no rules for or any description.
So and like I really tried to get the merfolk in, and it's just like, this is too weird. They take up too much space.
Yeah,
like to explain them, there's no short answer to explaining them. So
I'm happy you got the inanime in, but that's all.
Yeah, I mean, we had to pick our battles eventually, even with Cynthia being really nice and letting this book run way over the original word count. there were still cuts to be made, and ultimately I was like, the merfolk are not as valuable as the Canaan, and some people really disagreed with that.
You couldn't do a 500-page LARP structured book that
Yeah.
would have fallen apart.
What was the rule for Minds Eye Theater was purse or jacket. Like,
Yeah.
it has to fit in a purse or a jacket. That's why the books are, the smaller size and everything, is so that it could be carried around more easily and so forth. But like, putting the merfolk in, I'd either have to strip out all their lore, and then why bother, or we'd have to lose another chapter like Canaan and Enchanted, which I wasn't willing to do. So we just plundered them for their arts and then left.
Oh.
Yeah.
You also have for Aphrodisia in particular, where you have the recommendation for a special narrator called the Cupid. And I like that attention to detail about stuff that in a LARP setting, certainly you have to kind of attend to differently than you do at a table. And I say that as someone who, as I've said before, my primary LARP experience is with Nordic LARPs, which can get very uncomfortable.
Oh gosh.
There's a lot of overlap at this point, though, with those Nordic LARPs with the Aphrodisia stuff.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, anything with emotion manipulation is going to be like, all right, let's make sure everyone's okay with this.
Well, it's funny. I literally just past weekend, I just played a really intense experimental LARP about vampires and humans. And the way that they said there were a couple, it didn't have a lot of lore or anything like that. It was, they're vampires, they're humans. And like vampires, they were like, vampires will always overpower you if it comes to a confrontation. Like, you might get the drop on one briefly, but like, if it's at any way prolonged, you lose. And the other thing they did was to simulate vampiric charisma and intensity of personality. They're like, whenever a vampire talks to you, especially if they're focused on you, the classic kind of look into my eye kind of thing, they are the most. You must treat them as a superlative. The superlative you pick is up to you. So they might be talking seductively and you can panic and run because they're the most terrifying thing you've ever seen, but you never casually react to them. And it was a really interesting way of handling the emotional manipulation of vampires. Is it gave the target a choice of how they wanted to respond, but they always had to respond with a lot of emotion. There was no casual around vampires. That was a really interesting take on that.
The upshot of all that is Aphrodisia, or I guess in C20 Summer, use with discretion.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ones now I look back on, I'm like, I would have so many more disclaimers on this.
Yeah.
So many more, if I used it at all.
Yeah, I just think like if you had, I don't know, a new edition of The Shining Host and Player's Guide, it would like big chapter on just safety tools and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, I mean, just so much. Like, and I think that was kind of what I will give myself a little credit in the sense of that's kind of what the Cupid was for, is to make sure nobody's abusing this also.
Yeah, the fact that it's in here at all is impressive. Because,
for 2001, this is really good.
Yeah. And like, that was also why there's that disclaimer right afterwards, like, desire is not necessarily sexual. Like, you don't get to tell them they desire you, but what that means different things to people. So we were trying to like head that off, because that came from, I played in a vampire game in Philadelphia for a little while, and there was a guy who was intensely creepy and would just use presence in all the ways that you don't want them to, you know, and it got really, really like sexual assault territory, and all in game, but still making people feel profoundly uncomfortable. Yeah. And I was like, okay, no, we're not doing that in Changeling. We're not. I didn't have the language of safety tools and things for the time, but I was already thinking like, no, I do not want that.
No, this was right around the period, at least in the English role-playing world, it was like starting to become a thing. So
yeah, where we start having those conversations and you know, checking in with each other and trying to do better. But yeah, I like a lot of these arts. I just wish I could go back and edit them down. So I look back and like, I could say this with like 50 fewer words per power here.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very different, for instance, from the C20 Oneiromancy, for instance. But like, I think this works better for a LARP, and Oneiromancy works better tabletop than C20.
Yeah, and that was one of the things we always had to try and figure out. Like, some of the arts changed in both this and the original book because they don't LARP well.
Yeah, you can't have an art where the entire thing's hanging out in some sleeping person's dream, unless like that's your new set. That's where the game's set.
That's a special session, you know, like that's a special side session, which we've done. We did a walk into a dream kind of thing, but like, yeah, that's a whole session.
It's just the advanced level, right? Or one of the advanced levels does that, not the basic level.
Yeah. I was also very big on when I was writing Changeling powers, a lot of times you may notice like there's the dreaming will not allow you to do it this way. Like if you put someone to sleep, the dreaming protects them. So you can't put someone to sleep and then kill them because the dreaming says that's a party foul. No, you don't get to do that. So like one of the things I loved about Changeling was you, as the representative of the dreaming, the ST had an in-character version of no.
Yeah. I never thought about that. The storyteller has a player character in a Changeling LARP.
Yeah.
It's the dreaming.
Yeah, they are the dream, because the dreaming has sentience ascribed to it on numerous occasions.
Yeah. And its desires are very much in line with a storyteller trying to run a good LARP.
That's why it's like, okay, I'll let you put them to sleep, which, that has its own implications. But like if you try and kidnap them or murder them, the dreaming just spirits them away. It's like, no.
If you try to use further oneromancy on them, however.
Yeah, but I always like the fact that, as the dreaming, you could have a will of your own and just be like, no, that's Changelings. Like the bias towards narration over rules is written into the setting as the dreaming likes good stories. And so whatever makes a good story is what the dreaming will support, generally speaking.
Right on.
So, there's a new picture here.
I don't understand that picture. I'll be perfectly honest. They have all black eyes. I don't know what that's. I think they're supposed to look different in the reflection than they do, but we don't see enough of their face to establish that. So
yeah, and it's just, I'm just saying it's a vaguely creepy picture. That's all.
Yeah, no, but that one just baffles me. But like us adding the abilities that were added in Laws of the Night Revised. So
yeah, some of that was like. I mean, it's extra hilarious reading it now, bringing Dodge back in, bringing Dodge into Change.
I know.
When the 20th anniversaries got rid of it.
But that was literally the first part is just me updating, because after Shining Host came out, we wrote Laws of the Night Revised and we expanded the list of skills. So I just put them in Changeling. So, and then same thing with specializations, which we didn't need that, but that was a direction we were going at the time. So
I think this might be my favorite version of Piskies.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, really?
Yeah. I mean, they're the ones who keep getting different things for them. It's
they kind of suffer from the fact that they were brought in late, and at first people were like, they're too similar to Puka, so they got kind of changed. Even, other than the animal thing, they're basically like Pukas. They're written like their outlook and their attitude and their interaction and stuff is very Puka-like, and so then they got a little boggany and like.
Well, they're Kender. They were Kender from D&D. Is how they first felt.
Yeah, also that. Yep. Yeah. So I just tried to give them more of their own identity, just trying to make them like, okay, so these are kind of the sort of benevolent little folk legends of they get along well with humans, especially children, and the Kender trait, the kleptomania. And then like we go into the glamour systems, and that's where we really had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
What's the story behind the Jester's rules? Because I was like, yeah, I'm into this.
Jester's rules were Steve Grabagna's house rules for doing magic in his Winter's Edge Changeling game. He didn't like the bunk system, and I agreed, because I was like, writing bunks on index. We talked about this last time, writing bunks on index cards or whatever.
Yeah.
That if the storyteller has to write bunks for everyone, that's so many. That's so many bunks.
This feels like a precursor to the C20 bunk system.
Yes, it is absolutely a straight line.
Easier to use in some ways.
Yeah.
I think we somehow used basically these rules before in the game I played in before this book came out. Somehow, like we never had writing bunks on cards. Like you'd get a narrator to tell you the bunk rating if there was questions, like generally. But,
what Steve did was he codified these rules. What I loved about them, and the reason I asked him if I could put them in, was because they add so much to the play experience. Because they encourage you to use props, to act out things rather than narrate them, and to make them appropriate to your character or to the magic. To do as one of them's called the voodoo clause. Like having something sympathetic or contagious to your target or the type of magic. People got so much more into them, and they added so much to the play environment. Yeah, because their bunks were real. So to speak.
There was at least one time I've seen someone spend like the whole session just setting up a bunk. Like, and they were role playing and they're interacting, but they're like setting up this whole ritual thing to do the bunk.
Yep.
For the, like, I think it was Soothsay.
Yeah. Well, Soothsay bunks got crazy long term, and his bunks were, the rules were designed to like you're adding something to the game. Cool. And the more you add to the game, the more points your bunk was worth. So if you had the prop, you got an excuse to use a cool prop, so you could bring your prop, and that gave you a bunk trait. And then, if you acted out instead of narrate it, you got a bunk trait. So like the more you added to the game environment and to your costuming and props and everything, the more the bunk was worth. So it really rewarded what makes LARP interesting and fun. And every once in a while, you see those moments of game design that are just so simple and so brilliant that you're just like, well, dang. First of all, I'm jealous I didn't think of this first. But second of all, can I use this? Because this is amazing.
Excellent.
Yeah, I always want to give Steve a big shout out because he was also really nice about letting me use those and letting me test them and so forth. Because they're so much better than the random bunks. But I do like the fact that like, for the most part, he actually also has an upper limit because he doesn't want people to have to spend too long doing it either. Like over an hour, I think, is the longest that you get a bunk point for or bunk trait for.
No, it's 1 trait per hour if the bunk takes a longer.
Oh, okay. So I guess you could spend 5 hours on a bunk, and that would max out the trait.
But you have to do it in character.
Yeah, exactly. So like
that's
commitment to a bit right there. That's some serious stuff there.
Yeah.
And that's why I was like, these rules are so much better because also they allowed people to create bunks that were very evocative of their character. We had the 3-in-1, we called them. We had 3 characters who were big on soothsay. And one was a redcap who had a, quote, tarot deck that was a bunch of playing cards with like dirty pictures on them that they had scribbled stuff on, like, this is the tower, like it was like old Playboy playing cards or something, like, but they were a soothsayer, like they were a serious soothsayer. But like, and then you had like the Slua who had like the talking board and had all this other stuff, like sort of more traditional medium kind of stuff, and like a crystal ball. And then you had someone else who did like, he would divine by like casting lots, and he would throw sticks on the ground and like read patterns or whatever. And they would sometimes combine their bunks to weave soothsay together, and that was always a good time to watch that happen.
Was there anything else in this chapter that kind of was born out from stuff that you saw in sessions? Because it does seem like this is the kind of catch-all overflow chapter for...
Yeah, I mean, this was really the kitchen sink chapter.
Yeah, my favorite section is the whole endless dance politics in a Concordia section.
Oh, yeah. We really had fun with that because we played a very political Changeling game. Like, that's one of the things I love about Changeling, especially as a LARP, is that it is so tonally flexible in a way that I don't think any other White Wolf game is. And I think very few LARPs are in general, where like Changeling can be absolutely silly and ridiculous and then segue into Game of Thrones, with hardcore politics.
And you can do... if you have enough players in your LARP, you could do both simultaneously.
Yes, exactly. Our Changeling game was basically Game of Thrones if everyone was played by a Muppet. Like, like this is Changeling politics. This is Game of Thrones, but everyone is Muppets.
Beautiful.
And, or what if like House of Cards, before we knew Kevin Spacey was terrible, was replaced with the cast of Teen Titans Go? Like, like just... Changeling used to get so dismissed as like such a lighthearted or lightweight, not lighthearted. That too, I suppose. And I was like, the politics in this game can be insanely good.
Yeah, the status rules, if I'm vaguely remembering, like those are pulled from some of the stuff from Vampire, right?
Yes.
Some of these? Yeah.
Yeah, that was after I worked on Laws of the Night. So I was definitely, and I was working on the Anarch book not too long after this. So like those were definitely on my brain. And even just little things like we tried to simplify status though, because it got really tangled in some of the Vampire books because you had different types of status and we tried to simplify it. But like even just little stuff like proper form of address for a Duke or Duchess and like just to standardize some things for Changelings and like have people like, how do you address a Duke or a Prince or a Princess and like the Concordian politics, like that is something I am glad we dove into in C20 is really trying getting into Concordian politics because we finally had the overview of the setting. We'd seen Fool's Luck, we'd seen Kingdom of Willows, we'd seen Noblesse Oblige. We had it all put together in front of us, so we could kind of come up with. And this was sort of a half step for me. Is like at that point we had Fool's Luck and we'd had some of the Nobles books and some of the Changeling political meta plot had really come together. And we were trying to get that across without locking people into the meta plot of the books being like, no, you can use this as a model to have a really political game if you want.
Yeah. Although I do think, like, it seems to me like the stuff related to title, specifically like what the different ranks do, like, king versus duke versus, I don't remember it being this well defined ever anywhere else in Changeling. And
No,
I like
they
it.
weren't. We put this stuff in because as LARPers, we're like, we need this.
Yeah.
Like, and also to give people ideas for like, what does separate a duke from a count? Like what kind of stuff does it usually take? If you're a duke, what do you usually have lying around? Like, what is the sign of your office? Or, like the idea that it could always be changed because the dreaming is flexible.
Yeah.
But
and it's like stuff like dukes have at least can count up to 5 counts and barons as vassals. It's like, okay, there you go. That's like,
yeah, because we would have cities that had like 5 dukes and nobody below them.
yeah,
until you hit commoners, and we're like, okay, like, sure, it's Changeling, do whatever you want, but like that's like having 6 generals and 2 privates, like, and nobody in between. And I would always encourage people to be like, don't have too many of the top ranks of changelings in your game. First of all, they shouldn't have a whole lot of dukes in one area, generally speaking. And second, you're going to have a weird political game if that's the case. Like, it's going to be weirdly top heavy in a way that you might not want. But yeah, we nailed this stuff down because I'm like, LARPers need this kind of stuff. Like, or at least they can use it. Maybe not need, but they can make good use of it.
My favorite bits were probably the retainers, like having all the different types of retainers that you could have within like a household, but then also just the very subtle thing of like costume suggestions, or that's how I read it, of like, oh, members of this society wear this pin or this ribbon or this color. And I like that because in a LARP scenario, you might know that emblem and you might recognize that on someone else, but then it's like, do I let on that I know what that is? Or
yeah, we really wanted that kind of, because again, it's a detail that doesn't matter so much in tabletop, but in LARP is absolutely key.
I also want to point out, you do have playable Thalane and whatnot. Totally, it doesn't even mention not playing them. Explicitly says you should not have PC Beltane blades. I'm like, take that, Sealycourt.
Well, they're just awful.
Yeah, they're just so evil.
Yeah.
So evil. I mean, the Thalian, you can argue something about it being their nature, but you can't do that with the Beltane blade.
Yeah, and it's also more fun to have Thalane mischief than Beltane.
Yeah, and yeah, the Beltane blade is just so laser focused and evil. And I've had people have great Thalane stories where we had a person who played an ogre and nobody knew he was an ogre.
Yeah,
they thought he was just a weird troll, and he was raised by Kithane. So like, he had an interesting story. But like, the Beltane blade is a voluntary association that only picks bastards.
Yeah, it's like the horror thing of you have the horrible man-eating monster versus the terrible person where 3 people like that personally. Like, it's not the same.
Yeah, exactly. And like, also when you put in a note like, you cannot have a PC Beltane blade, some people will immediately want to play one.
Yep.
But I figured that gives the ST a fallback and be like, no, really. If they don't want them, they can point to the book and be like, no. The book says no, and this is why.
And it's like, you are playing a villain too. I think that's a good thing to point out for.
Yeah, you are a straight up villain. There's no misinterpreting them. They're not misunderstood. They are straight up villains. They were always written to be straight up villains. And there's nothing sympathetic about them. Like we were saying, a lot of the Shadow Court is sympathetic until you drill really far down. A lot of it, you can understand their grievances. Even if you don't agree with them or their methods, you can understand what they do. So if you want to include these, we're going to say why you shouldn't. But if you want to, then now you have the tools you need to understand why that's going to be so different. No one's going to stop you, but like, if someone wanted to play Beltane blade in my game, if I let them, it would definitely be one of those ones I talked about earlier where like, if you get caught, you're dead.
Yeah.
And I'm not helping you.
Well, yeah, that's also in LARP. There's a lot of half PC, half storyteller characters that are like kind of independent, but kind of.
Yeah, they're there for an NPC directed reason usually, or they answer back to the NPCs as it were. But I had a long running hunter game for when we were playtesting Laws of the Reckoning, and one of my players played a wayward, and I gave that speech. I'm like, if they catch you, you're probably toast. Like, and I said to him specifically, I was like, please don't just randomly murder characters. Like, I wouldn't do that. Like, I'm mostly focused on monsters. Just waywards are not too picky about collateral damage. I was like, if they find out and they run you out of the game, one way or the other, then you're done. And he was like, sure, I accept this risk to play this character. He lasted all 3 years. They found out at the last session. He took his shirt off and he had a giant wayward symbol on his back.
Yep.
And he had worked in the shadows. Like, they saved a monster at one point. They're like, oh, it's fine. He killed it later on. Like, he went back and murdered it. He's like, no monsters will live. And what happened? We saved them. I'm like, I don't know. Something you can investigate.
Yeah. I also like this chapter's the Kithane Justice section, along with the dueling part. Like, I eat that up, especially like in LARP. Those things come up.
Duels are so dramatic.
Yeah, but like the Fior system too, and
the duel was sort of also based on the fact that around that time I was watching a show called Conquest on the History Channel, and they had an entire episode on duels and how duels actually used to work in like the Renaissance in particular in Europe. And so that informed a lot of the rules there, and like and it was also based in part on the quick draw rules from Laws of the Wild West, because duels should be fast if they're going to be exciting, and I don't want to have 17 retests and all that other stuff. Like, try and streamline it, try to and the dueling oaths are great. And that was my other favorite. The last little thing, like, it doesn't have to be the last thing we talk about, but we had the Changeling calendar, because we're like, Changeling is a festival game. It has holidays. Like,
indeed,
and they're great excuses for games.
Yeah, well, I know Puka, we did that episode.
Oh man,
yeah, that was the Book of Days. It was like every single day has of the year,
all 366.
Yep.
And we were trying to include like what might go on those days, like what kind of parties would you have, or what activities can you do, because we wanted to encourage people. Because like a lot of times when I was in regular running Changeling games, we would just say, this is the Beltane game, this is the Midsummer game, this is the it was by holiday, as opposed to other games where you're just like, well, this is our June event or whatever.
Well,
like,
you need a reason for everyone to show up together and party.
Yeah. And Changelings had a full calendar, and like someone's like, why would you do that? I'm like, why wouldn't you have that for Vampire? Or like, we could do that for Vampire. We could have a list of holidays or observances or whatever. Changelings just love to party, and it's a great way to get a LARP together. So why don't we do these things? And like this, in the secret societies, I mean, you can see that's all straight out of Fool's Luck for the most part. I mean, there's a couple from the core, like Beltane Blade and the Crystal Circle, but like, we wanted to give people more, again, to break up the monocultures of different kiths, or the idea like, what if you're both veterans of the Accordance War? One Seelie, one Unseelie, both commoners, but like you fought on the same side during the war. Okay, that's a cool connection. That's a cool way to build character ties between characters.
Yeah, we had a conversation, I can't remember which episode it was we talked about this, but about the kind of axes of splat that you have. So it's like you have your kith, you have your seeming, you have your court, but then something like a society is this maybe a little more subtle thing that cuts across all of those.
Yeah. And it allows you to build characters and tie characters together that you might struggle to adapt. And it was also trying to break the splat book as character. This would also come back a couple years later when we were writing Requiem, is like the covenants for Vampire were also supposed to be a way to have characters from different clans associate with each other, and also create potentially divided loyalties. Like with the clans and covenants, you and I are both, Gangrel, but you're Order Dracul and Invictus. So we have the same family, but we went way different career paths. But if I meet an Invictus Ventru, like, we might have something in common where our clans are totally different, but now we're part of the same organization. It created wheels within wheels. And some of that was thinking that started with me, at least for Changeling. I mean, like, okay, let's say we're both Seelie Redcaps or something, and we're both Wilders, but I'm a veteran of the Accordance War and you're a member of the Crystal Circle. We have very different interests. We have very different social circles. Like, this is going to be a big change for us and help us differentiate our characters from each other.
Especially in the context of like a LARP, if you show up one day and it's like, oh, this character you get along with well because you're the same kith or the same court or whatever, and then the next day it's like, oh, you're in a different society that is diametrically opposed to mine, and it creates this new source of tension.
Or you have like the 6 player characters that are in a properly secret society, but like,
or that
they should be very different. Like, they're all different kiths and court and all that, and
Yeah, but they have that common thread, and that lets them build on it. And like,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's more of what we were talking about before. It's just putting out more things in there for players to interact with, for players to have conflict over, but not other than a couple. Like again, like the Beltane blade. We're sooner or later we're gonna have to stop punching these guys in the back of the head, but they kind of deserve it. So
Nah, keep punching.
where most of these societies might be, you might not like them, but they're not banned. They're not something that you're automatically going to be run out of town for being part of.
Well, even then, Beltane Bland won't be. They're not illegal under. I mean,
No,
unless
no.
it's full of red cap corbies, your area. But
yeah, everyone will watch you, and you might have a hard time once people know your association. But if they know what the Beltane Blade is about, but we tried not to have anything that was a do or die, like Cam Sabat. Like one cannot coexist with the others, like because that it shuts down role playing in ways that aren't worth it in a LARP. To have groups that cannot talk to each other, cannot coexist, cannot be, etc. That's no fun.
So aside from merfolk, is there anything else that you wish had been in this book? If you could pick like the top 2 or 3 things.
It's funny because a lot of the stuff that wound up not making it into this book wound up becoming stuff that would go on to inspire me when I worked on C20. As part of this sidebar, as part of this kitchen sink chapter at the end, I wanted to do a sidebar optional rule about divorcing seeming from chronological age. And they were like, that is way too different than the tabletop. We're not doing it. Like, because again, I would push that, especially with Changeling. Like you guys know well better than most. Like I put in a lot of stuff in the LARP that doesn't exist in the tabletop. And I did that because I was 20 and I thought I knew best. So, but some of it worked out, I think, but some of it, whatever. But point is, they were like, that changes a fundamental part of the game. We're not doing that.
Yeah. And I think that was fair in that situation. But
yeah, that was me getting real big for my britches, and Cynthia being like, "Easy, boy, easy," and she was right to do so.
Even at C20, I wish we had more text explaining what that actually means, because we have so much about the previous age-based one, and it's like, okay, but what does seeming mean now?
Yeah, I see what you're saying there.
I think on the whole, the change makes sense. It's just we need more.
We need more talking about what is good about it rather than why we're not doing it.
Not just what's good about it, how to use it. Because we have all this stuff about how seeming works in Cthulhu society under the old system. In the new system, there just wasn't the word count to put in much about it. So it would have been nice to
fair.
Somehow, I mean, there's no way to get it, but storyteller fault again. Yeah.
I wanted to put more politics in, but that got cut. We had a whole section about the Changeling meta plot because we wanted to present it as, here's what's going on right now. If you want a quick setup for a political campaign, like, because the LARP books have no meta plot. None of the Changeling meta plot really made it. Kamel or David, like they get mentioned very, very briefly, but there's not a whole lot of what was going on in the evolving storyline of like Kingdom of Willows and things. And we were like, maybe we should have a lore update. And that got cut. I think that would have been neat to have that. We also had a how to build a freehold.
That would have been nice.
That would have been really nice. That one got cut for space. It was like 7,000 words. It was basically its own chapter.
Yeah, Book of Freeholds for LARP.
Yeah, and that was the thing, because we had freeholds and hidden glens, and we had these sources that talked about freeholds and how they're created and how they're managed. And we wanted to talk more about balefire, and because my wife really loves the concept of balefire, and like that's why her signature immortal in the Boggenkith book is a balefire keeper.
Yep.
But
you just have so many game sessions that are just set in a freehold.
And that's how we assume, because also I think we had a part that was, people forget that if you're in a freehold, certain things aren't supposed to be as much of a factor as they would be elsewhere. Or certain things are much worse. If someone brings in an active source of banality into a freehold, that's bad news.
Yeah, you've snuggled in your cold iron knife. That's not good.
Yeah, exactly. And like, talking about like things like that, like, and also we had rules for kind of what would become in C20, what would become like resonance, like different freeholds give off different vibes. So like the balefire here gives you an extra bunk trait for these kind of bunks because it's just that kind of vibe. Or like you could draw on the character of the freehold to get like a bunk trait if you were acting in accordance with like the freehold's mood or ambiance. It was an out of game section because I'm a theater kid, surprise, and about how to do much more set dressing, because we have some in the core book, but
Yeah.
How to do lighting and music, and how to transform rooms very quickly and easily to make them look different and so forth. Like, we had a whole thing about like the literal nuts and bolts and the in-character magic and mechanisms of freeholds, and it just was way too long.
I think I want 3 more books this size. Just
There was this weird detour that we had, which was Cynthia once again correctly vetoed it, because it was entirely based on nothing from the tabletop games. And we had 3 cryptid kith that never made it. I had this whole pitch, and I was devastated when she didn't take them. And she's like, they're not in the tabletop. You can only go so far from the tabletop.
Yep.
And she's right. She's absolutely right. But like, the idea was there was an emerging faction. They were sort of like people who became possessed by fae spirits, and it was cryptids, tall tales, and urban legends. And nobody knew what they were. And you can see why this didn't make the cut. It's way too different. But I always thought it was a cool idea. And
it's kind of in the C20 Player's Guide.
Yeah. A little bit, yeah. I mean, I bided my time. I waited 20 years and did it.
Well, regardless, like, putting these 2 books side by side, like I said when we went through the first one, having never done a Changeling LARP before, I feel as though everything that I felt was missing that was necessary is in this book. So, like, I mean, the 2 complement each other very well. And yeah, as much as I would like to see more material always, I feel like...
Yeah, where's the PC creation rules for your Chimera to play?
Yeah, for example. But having these 2 side by side, I think, covers, if not every case that I can imagine coming up, gives me the tools to adjudicate on the fly, like you were saying before, Josh. So maybe it was Cynthia's wisdom. I don't know.
Yeah. It was. I mean, what she tried to do was keep my little 21-year-old self from bouncing too far afield. And also, she said, this is the book that you wanted. You wanted it to be something that expanded people's ability to play Changeling into different areas, or give them different options, or flesh out politics. Like, all of these things expand on existing ideas in the game, pretty much, and give people more choices, more ideas. And like, that's what this book is supposed to be about. So let's stick to that. She was an excellent dev. She was absolutely the best. But she wanted it to be that expansion of, okay, a lot of these concepts are touched on, or at least mentioned briefly in the first book. Now we're going to go into detail. Here's the Shadow Court. Here's a whole chapter of these people who got briefly mentioned before. Now we're going to flesh them out. I think we briefly mentioned the Nunahe and the Inanime, and now we're going to flesh them out. And we had Kinane, but we didn't really talk about them much. We talked about Enchanted Mortals a little, but so if you were curious about something, the idea was you could go to this book and probably find more on it. More detail and more choices, more options, everything. So
I think it was successful in that goal. So.
I believe so too.
I'm glad.
It has a few little updatey things, but it's still very compatible. Like, it's not like it's a whole new edition trying to sneak in or something.
Yeah, you can definitely tell this is the new skill system. For example, like I said, like, not only in terms of adding skills to the game, but like the way the skills are written. Shining Host was written before Laws of the Night Revised, which was sort of the new standard. Like, Laws of the Night was always the default book that the others were based on or referenced. So you can see, like, that was like the more loosey-goosey, fewer skills. Now we're going to add more skills to be more like the tabletop game, and the skills are going to function slightly differently. So we're updating a little. And And that was me just being very overprotective of my Changeling players and wanting them to have the most up-to-date information.
Yeah, I mean, you would need that for crossover too.
Yes, that too. As I didn't want them to fall behind, because some of the older Mind's Eye Theater books never got updated. So, like, the rules in them didn't technically work. You could usually fix them relatively quickly.
All you have to do is give you 7 health levels instead of 4.
Yeah, pretty much. This book was such a love letter. I mean, all of the Changeling books that I've worked on, then they're such like a milestone. Like I said, if you look at the playtester list, some of the names are the same from high school, but some of them are changed because my friend group shifted over time in college, and this was the college game as opposed to the high school game. And I look back on it, and it's also, for me, it's like just this little encapsulation of an era that just came along, remembering all that we were doing back then and all we wanted to do.
I was saying to Josh, we did our War in Concordia episode, and until I started my read-through to prepare for that, I didn't really understand. Well, I understood, but I didn't have a point of reference for in C20 the idea of a grump receiving a big enough hit of glamour to go all the way back to Childling. I'm like, well, what would that even look like? And then opening up that book and on the credits page, seeing the thanks to all of the White Wolf forum names that I remembered from when I was like 15. I was like,
Yup.
just all at once it hit. So,
and there were so many. The forum communities were so strong, and like,
yeah.
I remember being told later on by some of the White Wolf people, and just that on the Mind's Eye board, I was the self-appointed guardian of Changeling, and I would just swoop in and try and answer questions about Changeling, or clarify rules, or defend it when vampire players got persnickety or whatever,
as they so often do.
Yeah, congratulations, you're the first game. You're the least powerful by default.
Wah,
So, you shouldn't care that much about power, but I can't fix that. Yeah, it was always great to see, and like in C20, like the dedication and the player's guide also, like I get emotional just looking at those dedications and those credits pages and things, because there's so much. When C20 was announced, a lot of people were like, how well is this really going to do? I'm like, wait and see. Changeling's people are loyal, and we are still here. And they're like, what? And like, trust me. And they're like, it's now like the second highest Kickstarter they've ever had for one of the games. Like, yes, I know.
Beat Werewolf by $35.
Hey, a win's a win. I'll take it. And like, as a LARP community, Changeling has never gone away either. Because again, I think it's the most LARPable, or tied with Vampire for most LARPable game. And it's a lot more fun than Vampire a lot of the time. It's a very different focus, but it's a lot more flexible. That again, Vampire also was a casualty of being the first out the door every time. And they were learning a lot about what worked and what didn't, and what players wanted and what didn't. And like, when you look at the shift from first edition Vampire to the last edition before the New World of Darkness, and you see like how much it has shifted away from personal horror and everything to more politics and supernatural intrigue, and that's okay. It can evolve over time. Someone told me they said it went from Interview with the Vampire to Underworld, and I was like, yeah, pretty much. The main inspirations shifted.
Yeah, I could say it went from Interview with a Vampire to Vampire Lestat, even.
Hey, let's not say things we can't take back. But that's okay. Like, games change over time. It's how they stay alive. But like, Changeling was interesting. It was like Changeling never had a pop culture base the way some of the other games did. Because I mean, there has been Fae material in film and television, but not in the way that there has been for vampires and werewolves and wizards and stuff. The closest you get is a series like Lost Girl.
Yeah, but that was not big.
No. It was very niche, very Canadian.
Yeah, we did on our inspirations. There's another New Zealand show called Almighty Johnsons, which I think is in a similar vein.
Yes, Almighty Johnsons is fantastic.
Yeah. But it's similar, like, that was not big deal. Everybody watched it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, with Vampire, like, you can watch people like Interview with the Vampire, and then like Blade and Underworld, and then like True Blood, and then of course you got Twilight, but you've got like, you can watch, like, there's different generations of vampire inspiration. Changeling didn't really have that.
Yeah, it's like the mists keeps from society.
The closest we got was when we created Lost, which was such a very different game, and very intentionally a very different game, which was in many ways looking much more at like the folklore version of the Fae are not your friends and so forth. But even so, it was interesting because we were talking about, like, there's no pop culture reference, which means it stays fairly timeless. Changeling surges, like, every time I go to the Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair or the New York Renaissance Fair, when I'm wearing my tabard, I have several Changeling tabards. If I'm wearing any one of them, someone calls it.
Yep.
And granted, at a Ren Fair, the odds are better than most places, but still, it's like they're still out there. Like, the Changeling folk are still out there. That's why I knew it was going to do well. And the Changeling LARP community is a big part of, I think, what has kept Changeling going. It's funny because, like, I don't want to jump ahead to like Changeling 20th, but like, when the Changeling 20th writing room got together, it turned out that so many of us had been holding on to ideas for like 10 years or more that we wanted to bring to the table and be like, can we do this in Changeling? Should we do this in Changeling? And how do we do this?
Yeah, we'll get to it, but there's a reason it's more so than all the other ones. It's more of a new addition as opposed to the 20th anniversary edition take that the other game.
Yeah.
It is interesting though to see, like, now that I'm looking back, I really hadn't connected the dots of like some of the concepts that were toyed with here or didn't make the cut for the player's guide did actually kind of kick around in my head until a lot later when I got to use them.
A few that did got into. It's like, this is where the tabletop rules came from, the LARP book.
Yep. And that was always the weird thing too, because the LARP books were always supposed to be a companion of the tabletop and not innovate any more than absolutely necessary. But here we are.
Yeah. Well, Vampire did the same thing. There was a lot of.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, yeah, Pete, is there any place people listening could reach out to you?
I'm afraid I've mostly left what was once called Twitter. I have an account there technically, but I never check it. So usually the best way to get in touch is contact through my website, which is peterwoodworth.com, positively Woodworthy.
There will be a link in the show notes.
Okay. And there's there's a contact form. People want to reach out, even if it's just to share a story or things like that. I always love hearing about Changeling. That's one of the nice things. Like I said, when I go to Ren fairs, I usually have, not only does someone call it out, someone shares a story. They're like, oh my God, Changeling, I played this, this, or it's always a fun community moment. So
yeah, and you can reach out to us. Go to the website changelingthepodcast.com. We have a Patreon. That would really help things out. Patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. You can find us on Facebook, our Facebook page, Changeling the Podcast. You can send us a toot on Mastodon, changelingpod@dice.camp. Join our hopping Discord. That's the best place to directly talk to us. That's discord.me/CTP. You can send us an email, podcast@changelingthepodcast.com.
There is also a YouTube
YouTube channel, Changeling the Podcast. And all the links, including to Pete's website, will be in the show notes. And once again, I'm Josh.
I remain Puka.
Thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Old school Oniromancers have learned the hard way that the dreaming protects its own from party fouls, such as the example given in this episode of putting someone to sleep then killing them. We did a quick survey and found that 8 out of 10 Oniromancers agree that the 3 most egregious other dreaming party fouls include tripping and knocking over all the emotional baggage in someone else's dream, leaving a dream portal open so the Firchlis gets everywhere, or vomiting in the corner of a dream realm and then sitting there crying for hours over how your boyfriend of 3 weeks hasn't called you back and you just don't think he loves you anymore. Note that playing Flip Cup on the edge of the Silver Path is not considered a party foul, it's just tacky. In any case, whether LARPing or dicing around the table, we urge you to remember good dream magic etiquette. Similarly, we urge you to check out our Discord at www.discord.me/CTP for news and discussion. And we implore you to check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. We'd like to thank our patrons for their support, and they include Derek, Dorcatus, Oreo, Roz Caboose, Sandjigger, Sija, Terry Robinson, and Tricerabeth. By signing up, you can get a shout-out at the end of each episode as well, so please consider doing so today, and or leaving a review of our show on the listening platform of your greatest convenience. LARP on Wayne, LARP on Garth, and until next time, keep on dreaming.